The question nobody on Outpost Sarin 4 could answer was why the beagle followed the girl. Not the human attaché's daughter, the other one. The quiet one. The 12-year-old who sat in the back corner of the Joint Species Education module with her knees drawn up and her face angled toward the viewport like she was trying to memorize the color of a sky that wasn't hers. Marin Calloway. She had arrived on the Outpost 7 months ago when her mother took the xenolinguistics posting, and in those 7 months she had said fewer words to the other children in the module than most of them said before morning nutrition. The beagle's name was Pepper. He was 9 years old, which in Earth Dog years meant his muzzle had gone white, and his joints clicked when he stood, and his ears dragged on the deck plating when he walked, heavy velvet flaps that swept dust and crumbs and atmospheric particulates into the fur along their edges. He had been Marin's grandmother's dog before her grandmother died on a Tuesday in October, in a house that smelled like wood polish and rosemary, with Pepper asleep on the foot of the bed, and the autumn light coming through curtains Marin's grandmother had sewn herself. He had been Marin's dog after that, not by choice, not by assignment, but by the simple arithmetic of who was left. Marin's mother had told the transit authority that the beagle was a certified emotional support companion, because there was no other way to bring a live Earth animal onto a diplomatic Outpost 6 relay jumps from Saul, and the transit authority had looked at the paperwork and looked at the beagle and approved the filing with a note that read simply, "Low risk, small, old." All of which was accurate, none of which explained the thing that was happening. Years later, when Commander Tessic Val of the Outpost's Joint Education Directorate submitted his end-of-year behavioral assessment to the Accord's Youth Development Archive, he would write a passage that the archivists flagged for special annotation. The annotation would be forwarded to the Accord's Interspecies Development Council, and from there to a subcommittee on non-standard therapeutic interventions, and from there to a xenobiologist on a research station who had been studying Earth companion-animal bond behavior for 11 years and who, upon reading Tessic's passage, closed her terminal and sat in silence for a long time before requesting the full file. But all of that came later, and none of it would have happened without what came first: the girl and the dog, and the 7 months of silence that preceded the morning everything shifted. Tessic would tell the story to colleagues afterward when they asked, and they did ask, because the assessment he filed circulated further than any document he had produced in a 20-year career, and he always started it the same way, not with the data, not with the developmental frameworks or the social mapping overlays or the 7-point scale he had broken. He started it with the question. The same question the maintenance staff asked, and the nutrition bay servers asked, and the Pelini social coordinator asked, and the Carl Seth gravity athletics coach asked. The question that the entire outpost, across 9 species and 400 personnel, eventually asked in one form or another, and that none of them could answer until they stopped asking it and simply watched. Tessic had watched Marin Calloway since her first day. Watching was his function. He administered the Joint Species Education module for 41 students across 9 species, and his training in developmental xenopsychology meant he was attuned to patterns that other instructors missed. The pattern Marin presented was not complicated. It was simply empty. She completed assignments. Her marks were adequate, never exemplary, never deficient, the precise median that indicated a mind capable of more but unwilling to reach for it. She did not initiate conversation with any other student. When addressed directly, she responded with the minimum viable sentence: "Yes, no, I don't know, it's fine." She ate alone in the nutrition bay, choosing the corner table that faced the bulkhead instead of the room, her tray positioned so that the beagle could not steal from it, though the beagle tried with the methodical persistence of an animal that had never once accepted a boundary as permanent. She walked the corridors alone. She sat in the education module alone, and when the other children, human and alien both, organized into the spontaneous clusters that developmental psychology predicted, She remained in her corner by the viewport, arms around her knees, watching the color of someone else's sky. On the 14th day, the module's social coordinator, a Pelini named Dravos whose species communicated primarily through bioluminescent pattern shifting, and who therefore had an unusually precise read on nonverbal cues across species, submitted a private concern to Tesic's terminal. The message was 3 lines. The human child's social output has dropped below measurable threshold. She responds to direct address but initiates nothing. Her companion animal appears to be her sole attachment object. I do not know what to recommend. Neither did Tesic. He reviewed the Outpost's human resources database for guidance on childhood bereavement across species boundaries. The database contained 47 entries on Varathi mourning protocols, 31 entries on Kalseth grief management rituals, which involve sustained physical contact with kin group members over a period of weeks, 19 entries on Drenathi emotional processing frameworks, and exactly 1 entry on human childhood grief. It was 6 sentences long. The final sentence read, "Outcomes vary widely and are highly individual. Consult specialist if available." There was no specialist available. There was Tesic, and there was Marin's mother, and there was a 12-kilogram beagle sleeping on a blanket that smelled like rosemary. Tesic had seen grief before. His species, the Varathi, processed loss through a structured communal mourning period, 40 days of shared silence, after which the mourner was reintegrated through graduated social contact administered by the community's elder network. Humans, he had learned across 2 decades of cross-species educational work, did not have a standardized protocol. Human children, he had learned further, sometimes built walls instead of bridges. The walls looked like silence. They looked like adequate marks and minimum viable sentences. They looked like a girl sitting in a corner, watching a viewport, holding a dog's ear. He had tried once at the end of month 2. A gentle, structured attempt. He had arranged for Marin to be paired with the attaché's daughter Devon for a 2-person lab exercise, reasoning that another human child might bridge the gap more naturally than an alien one. The exercise lasted 40 minutes. Marin completed her half of the work in silence, answered Devon's questions with single words, and when the exercise ended, she walked to her corner seat and pulled her knees up, and the beagle pressed against her shin, and the 40 minutes might as well not have happened. Devon had looked at Tesic afterward with an expression he recognized from his own mirror, the helplessness of someone who has extended a hand and watched it hang in empty air. The beagle had its own pattern, as steady and unvarying as the Outpost's rotational cycle. It slept under Marin's bunk in quarters 7C, curled on a blanket that had come from Earth and smelled, according to the Outpost's environmental monitoring system, like a chemical compound the system could not identify and had flagged as unknown organic trace level no hazard. The compound was rosemary. Tesic learned this later from the girl's mother, who told him it had been her own mother's garden plant and that the blanket had lain in the greenhouse for years before it was packed for transit. The beagle slept on it every night. The girl slept with her hand hanging over the bunk's edge, fingers resting on the beagle's back, touching the blanket underneath, maintaining a chain of contact that ran from living girl to living dog to dead woman's garden through fabric and fur. Each morning the beagle walked with Marin to the education module, its short legs working steadily to match her pace, its nose sweeping the deck in wide arcs that suggested the corridor was an endless buffet of invisible information. It lay at her feet during instruction, curled into a shape that looked like a brown and white comma, its breathing slow and audible in the quiet moments between lessons. When Marin walked back to quarters, it walked with her. When she sat in her corner and pulled her knees up, it pressed itself against her shin and sighed a long, whole-body exhalation that seemed to carry more weight than a 12-kilogram animal should have been able to produce. For 7 months this was the entirety of it, girl and dog, silence and routine. The other students orbited around Marin the way debris orbits a gravity well never touching, never quite escaping, aware of the mass without understanding it. The human children on the outpost, 4 others, ranging from 8 to 16, had tried the obvious approaches in the first weeks. Invitations to game nights in the recreation module, offers to sit together at nutrition. The attaché's daughter, a forthright girl named Devon who possessed the social confidence of someone raised in diplomatic compounds, had walked directly to Marin's corner table on the second day and said, "Are you okay?" 2 words came back, "I'm fine," delivered in a tone so flat that even a 12-year-old could hear the door closing behind it. Devon had tried twice more before accepting the boundary, and Tessic noted in his file that the rejection was not hostile. It was not anything. It was the practiced nothing of a child who had learned that the safest way to handle people was to give them exactly enough response to make them go away without giving them enough to make them stay. The alien students had their own calibrations. The Varathi adolescents read Marin's body language and classified her as socially dormant, a developmental state their own species experienced briefly during mourning periods, after which structured reintegration was applied through communal processes refined over millennia. The Kalsetha students, whose species understood isolation primarily as a physical danger, their home world's predator ecology made solitary individuals vulnerable, watched Marin with the uneasy attention of beings who recognized that something was wrong but whose instinctive response, which was to physically surround the isolated individual and stay there until the danger passed, did not translate across species without causing more problems than it solved. Marin's mother, who loved her daughter with the helpless, exhausted love of a single parent managing grief and a career, and an alien posting simultaneously, had told Tessic in a corridor conversation at the end of month 3 that she did not know how to reach her own child and was afraid that pushing would break whatever was left. "She talks to the dog," her mother said. Her voice had the particular roughness of someone who has been managing composure as a professional skill and has reached the shift's end. "At night, I hear her through the partition. She tells him things about her grandmother, about the house, about the garden and the way the kitchen smelled on Sunday mornings. She doesn't tell me. She hasn't told me anything about her grandmother since the funeral." Tessic documented it in his weekly notes with the precision his training required. Subject M. Calloway continues to present social withdrawal pattern consistent with unresolved grief response. Earth companion animal remains bonded. No behavioral concerns with the animal. Recommend continued monitoring. He did not document the thing he noticed on day 143 because he did not yet understand what he was noticing. It was a corridor interaction. Marin was walking from the nutrition bay back to the education module, the beagle trotting beside her with its ears swinging in counterpoint to its stride, when she passed a cluster of Varathi students, 3 of Tessic's own species, adolescents whose social bonding drives were peaking, and who consequently moved through the outpost in a tight, chattering pack. They were not unkind children. They were precisely the demographic that developmental models predicted would reach toward isolated peers. One of them, Tessic later identified her as Rilith, 14 standard years, top 3rd academically, notably empathic even by Varathi standards, shifted her trajectory as Marin approached. Rilith's intent was transparent to a Varathi observer. The slight angling of her stride, the opening of her shoulder posture, the preparatory flicker of her secondary eyelids that preceded social engagement in their species. She was going to speak to the human girl. Tessic recognized the approach pattern from 50 meters down the corridor through the security feed he monitored during transition periods, and felt a small, professional hope that he immediately suppressed because hope was not data. Marin saw it too. Tessic watched her posture tighten, shoulders lifting by 2 centimeters, chin dropping, the micro-flinch of someone bracing for contact the way another person might brace for cold water. She did not speed up. She did not change course. She simply closed, the way a door closes, quietly and completely, and Rilith's approach vector stalled 3 meters out as the social signal reached her, the human body language that even a Varathi adolescent could read without training as not now, not here, not available. Rilith drifted back to her cluster. Marin continued walking, the beagle beside her, and the corridor returned to its normal traffic pattern. An unremarkable interaction, a non-event. Tessic would not have flagged it at all except for one detail. The beagle. The dog had not looked at Rilith, had not altered its pace or raised its head or shown any visible awareness of the near interaction. But in the 3 seconds after Marin's posture tightened, the beagle had shifted its walking line by approximately 10 centimeters, moving from Marin's left side to a position slightly ahead and slightly closer, so that the outer edge of its body, the warm, solid, 12-kilogram fact of it, pressed against Marin's calf with each stride. The girl's hand dropped. Her fingers found the beagle's ear, and her grip on the velvet flap was not a pet. It was an anchor. She held the ear the way a drowning swimmer holds a line that has been thrown, not with gratitude but with need, and the beagle adjusted its pace to accommodate the grip and did not pull away, and the two of them walked through the corridor like that, the girl holding the dog's ear, the dog holding the girl's weight, and Tessic thought, for the first time in a 20-year career built on behavioral frameworks and quantified outcomes, a thought that did not belong in any assessment he had ever filed. That animal knows exactly what it is doing. He pulled the security feed footage that evening and watched the 10-second sequence 4 times. The shift in the beagle's position was so small that a normal observer would have attributed it to the natural variation of a short-legged animal adjusting its gait. But Tessic had spent 20 years studying the microbehaviors of children across 9 species, and he knew the difference between random variation and response. The beagle had responded to Marin's distress the way a medical instrument responds to a change in vital signs, immediately, precisely, and without any visible decision-making process. The response was not trained. It was not operant conditioning. It was something older than training and more reliable than conditioning. It was the thing that Earth called bond, and that the galactic behavioral sciences had no single word for, because most galactic species did not form this particular kind of attachment with non-sapient organisms. The closest Varathi analog was the relationship between a mourner and their silenced companion during the 40-day grief period, but that relationship was structured, temporary, and culturally mediated. The beagle's relationship with Marin was none of those things. It was simply present, the way gravity was present, invisible, constant, and strong enough to hold things in place. He began watching differently after that. Day 151, the education module during the 3rd instruction period. Tessic was administering a collaborative exercise, species mix groups of 4, building conceptual models of first contact communication scenarios. Standard curriculum, designed to force cross-species interaction in a structured context where the students could focus on the task instead of on each other. Marin had been assigned to a group with 2 Kalsethi students and a young Drenathi. The Kalsethi were twice Marin's size. Torek and his clutch sibling Venesh, both 15 standard years, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, their skin a deep amber that darkened to burnt orange at the joints, their voices pitched in a bass register that carried through bulkheads and made smaller species furniture rattle. They were not threatening children. They were awkward children. The Kalsethi adolescent growth phase produced beings whose bodies had outgrown their social calibration by a significant margin, and they moved through the outpost's corridors and classrooms with the careful, deliberate attention of someone carrying something fragile in hands that could crush hull plating without meaning to. Torek, in particular, had a quality Tessic had come to think of as gentle enormity, a constant, visible effort to take up less space than his body required, to modulate his bass voice downward, to keep his broad gestures within a radius that would not knock things off shelves or startle smaller students. The effort was endearing. The results were mixed. The Drenathi student was Myrle, compact, precise, silver-furred, with the oversized pupils of a species that had evolved on a dim-lit world and compensated with exceptional visual and auditory acuity. She was quiet by disposition, a quality that in a Drenathi meant her silence was active. She was always listening, always processing, always building elaborate internal models of the room's emotional architecture that she would periodically share with startling accuracy when someone asked the right question. Marin sat at the edge of the group with her chair pulled back from the table by 15 centimeters. The beagle lay at her feet. The two Kalsethi were discussing the exercise in their own language, voices rumbling, hands moving in the broad, emphatic gestures their species used for emphasis. Myrle sat with her silver fur catching the module's overhead light, her oversized pupils tracking the conversation. Tessic watched from his observation station as Marin's gaze moved between the viewport and the group. She was not participating. She was not refusing to participate. She was simply absent, present in body and gone in every way that mattered, and Tessic recognized the pattern because he had been documenting it for 5 months and it never varied. Then the beagle stood up. The movement was stiff, 9-year-old joints, the careful unfolding of a body that had earned its aches honestly and unhurried. The dog walked out from under Marin's desk, past her boots, past the Drenatha's chair, around the table's support strut, and stopped directly in front of Torek. He sat. He looked up at the Kalseth adolescent with the particular expression of beagles throughout history, eyebrows raised into furrows that created an impression of profound philosophical inquiry, head tilted at an angle that communicated both intense interest and a complete absence of agenda, ears pooling on the floor like brown velvet puddles spreading from a small, calm center. Torek stopped talking. His enormous amber hand mid-gesture froze. He looked down at the dog. The dog looked up at him. The education module went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens, and nobody has decided whether it is a problem or a gift. "The animal," Torek said. His bass voice was careful, modulated to its lowest register, the Kalsethi equivalent of a whisper, though it still vibrated in Tessic's sternum. "It is looking at me." Marin's head turned. For the first time in 7 months, her expression carried something other than distance. It carried alarm, the sharp, visible alarm of someone whose controlled environment has just been breached from inside. "Pepper," she said, "come here." The beagle did not come. The beagle remained seated in front of Torek, tail tapping the deck in a slow, patient rhythm. Tap, 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 its entire 12-kilogram body oriented toward the Kalsethi boy with the focused attention of something that had made a decision about this room and was waiting for the universe to catch up. Venesh leaned back, his amber skin darkening at the throat, a Kalseth involuntary stress response. "Torek, the earth animal, is it safe?" Marin stood. Her chair scraped. The alarm on her face was shifting into something closer to panic, the particular panic of a child who has spent 7 months building a wall out of silence and is watching something walk through it without asking permission. "He's fine. He won't hurt you. He just Pepper, come here." "Now." The beagle's tail tapped. Torek looked at Marin. He looked at the dog. And then, with the ponderous deliberation of a species that did everything slowly and thoroughly, he lowered his enormous hand. His palm was wider than the beagle's entire skull. He held it 6 centimeters from the dog's nose. Pepper sniffed. The nose worked, twitching, cataloging, processing whatever invisible library of chemical and biological information. A beagle's 220 million olfactory receptors extracted from a Kalseth adolescent's palm. The dog was reading Torek's hand the way Tessic read a behavioral assessment, with trained, methodical attention to every variable. Then the sniffing stopped. The beagle pressed its forehead into Torek's palm and leaned, not a nudge. A lean, a full-body redistribution of weight. 12 kilograms of old dog pressing into the Kal-Sethi boy's hand, with the deliberate commitment of an animal that had evaluated the options and chosen this one. Torek made a sound, quiet and involuntary, a bass vibration below speech. Tessik's auditory implant caught it, and he recognized it from his study of Kal-Sethi developmental psychology, the sound a Kal-Sethi juvenile made when something small trusted them. Their species' awareness of their own size was acute, and lifelong the knowledge that their hands could crush what they were trying to hold, that the gap between gentle intentions and enormous physical capacity was a space where fragile things broke. The moment when something small chose to lean against a Kal-Sethi instead of flinching away was, in their developmental literature, described as a foundational bonding event, a confirmation that strength could be trusted. The beagle leaned harder. Torek's other hand came up, enormous fingers hovering over the dog's back, trembling with the effort of restraint. Marin was standing beside the table. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled into her palms, and her face held an expression Tessik had never seen on her. Not alarm anymore, not panic, not the closed door. Something was opening. It was small and frightened, and it looked like a window that had been painted shut and was being forced, slowly, from inside, by something that needed the light more than it needed the safety of the dark. "You can pet him," she said. Her voice cracked on the second word. "He likes it behind the ears." Torek's hovering hand descended. His fingers found the space behind Pepper's right ear, and the dog's eyes closed and his tail accelerated from a measured tap to a steady beat, and his entire body softened into the touch with boneless surrender. Venash leaned forward, his throat darkening had faded. "May I also?" "Yeah," Marin's voice was barely audible. "Yeah, you can." Two Kal-Sethi adolescents, their combined mass exceeding 300 kilograms, lowered themselves to the floor and petted a 12-kilogram beagle with delicate, reverent concentration. Venash's thick fingers found the dog's chest, and Pepper rolled onto his side with a groan of contentment that vibrated through the deck plating and drew looks from 3 adjacent tables. Myrle moved her chair closer, her oversized pupils wide with the cataloging focus her species reserved for phenomena they could not yet classify but recognized as significant. Marin watched. She was standing at the group's edge, hands clasped tight, shoulders drawn up, and on her face was the visible, readable war between the wall she had built and the thing happening on the other side of it. The beagle solved it. The way the beagle solved everything, not with force or drama, but with the quiet mechanics of an animal that understood gravity better than anyone in the room. Pepper withdrew from the Kal-Sethi's hands, walked back on his stiff joints, sat at Marin's feet and looked up at her. Then he looked at Torek, then at Marin, then at Torek. His head swiveled with the patient, obvious, deeply unsubtle insistence of an animal that had identified 2 things it wanted in the same room and could not understand why they were not closer together. Rilith, the Varathi girl who had tried to approach Marin weeks earlier, had been watching from 2 tables away. She stood. She walked to the group's edge. Her secondary eyelids flickered. "Marin, can I sit with you?" Tessik held still, every system waiting for the next data point. Marin looked at Rilith. She looked at the beagle. The beagle's tail tapped once, a single, quiet percussion. "Okay," Marin said, 2 syllables. It carried everything. Rilith sat. The beagle shifted to accommodate the new body, settling between Marin's feet and Rilith's chair with the practiced ease of an animal that had been making room for people its entire life. The group finished the exercise. It was not exceptional work. The conceptual model they produced was adequate, solidly in the middle range, notable primarily for the fact that it had been completed at all. But Tessik noticed that Marin had contributed 2 verbal observations during the final 15 minutes of the session. 2. After 5 months of 0. The first was a correction to Torek's model of signal delay interpretation that was, Tessik noted with professional interest, technically superior to the answer in his instructor's guide. The second was a suggestion to Myrle about the model's visual layout, delivered in a voice so quiet that Myrle had to lean closer to hear it, and in leaning closer had entered Marin's 15-centimeter buffer zone, and Marin had not pulled back. The beagle was asleep under the table through both contributions. His work, apparently, was done for the afternoon. After the session ended, Tessic observed Marin walking toward the corridor with Rilith beside her and the beagle between them, and for the first time the beagle was not pressed against Marin's calf. It was walking in the center of the corridor, equidistant between the two girls, its ears swinging, its nose working, its tail maintaining the slow, steady rhythm of an animal that had arranged the room to its satisfaction, and was content to maintain the arrangement at walking speed. Tessic documented this in his personal observation file, the one that did not go to the directorate, the one he kept because some things did not fit assessment frameworks, and those were usually the things that mattered most. The change was not instant. Walls built over months did not come down in an afternoon, and anyone who expected them to was confusing recovery with performance. But the beagle had opened a door not in Marin's wall, but in the room itself, and through that door, steadily, light was entering. Day 160. Marin sat with Rilith's cluster at the nutrition bay. She did not speak much. She ate her food and listened to the Varathi chatter and occasionally reached down to scratch the beagle's ears under the table. The beagle lay across her feet like a 12-kilogram anchor, and provided the counterweight that seemed to make the act of being near other people physically possible. Tessic watched from the faculty table, and noted that Marin's chair was positioned 10 centimeters closer to Rilith than it had been the day before, and that the distance between them was closing at a rate that would be invisible to anyone who was not measuring. At one point during the meal, the beagle emerged from under the table, walked 3 meters to where a Kal-Sethi student named Varath was eating alone, a boy whose clutch siblings were in a different nutrition rotation, leaving him temporarily solitary, and sat beside his chair. Varath looked down. The beagle looked up. The familiar expression, profound interest, zero agenda. Varath's hand dropped and found the beagle's ear, and the beagle leaned against his massive ankle, and Varath's solitary meal became something slightly different, something that included, at minimum, a warm 12-kilogram presence and the steady sound of a tail tapping against a chair leg. Tessic watched Marin watch this happen. Her expression was unreadable, but her hand had stopped moving on the table's surface, and she was still for a long moment before she reached down to touch the empty space where the beagle had been, and then looked across the nutrition bay at the old dog leaning against a stranger's ankle, and did not call him back. Day 168. The Outpost's recreational module hosted a species integration cultural exchange, a monthly event where students presented an element of their homeworld's traditions. Tessic expected Marin to sit in the back corner, as she had done for the previous 6 exchanges, watching the viewport. Instead, she sat in the 3rd row. The beagle was in her lap. Torek sat beside her, his massive frame requiring 2 chairs, and when the Kal-Sethi cultural presenter demonstrated a percussive rhythmic exercise that involved striking the floor with open palms in synchronized patterns, Torek's hands twitched with the desire to participate, and Marin noticed and said, quietly, "Go." 1 word. Torek went. He joined the demonstration, his palm strikes vibrating through the deck hard enough to rattle the presentation display, and when he returned to his seat, Marin said, "Your timing was off on the 3rd set." Torek's skin lightened at every joint. The beagle's tail tapped against Marin's knee, and Tessic entered 3 words in his observation file: peer feedback initiated. Day 171. Myrle approached Marin at the start of the instruction period and asked, in her quiet, precise way, whether the beagle could sit with her during the atmospheric sciences lecture. Her species' auditory sensitivity made certain lecture topics, particularly those involving simulated weather system audio modeling, uncomfortable, and she had discovered that the beagle's breathing, when close enough to hear, provided a low-frequency counterbalance that made the discomfort manageable. Marin looked at her. She looked at the beagle. "He's not mine to lend," she said, and then, before Tessic could note the refusal, "but he goes where he wants. If he goes to you, that's him." She unclipped the leash. The beagle stood, stretched with the elaborate full-body extension of a dog for whom every stretch was a production, walked directly to Myrle and sat at her feet. "Looks like he wants to," Marin said. Myrle's hand found the beagle's ear. Marin sat in her usual seat without the dog, and Tessic watched for signs of distress and found none. She glanced at Myrle and the beagle twice during the lecture, quick, checking looks, the expression of someone confirming that a thing she valued was being properly handled, and when the lecture ended and the beagle walked back to her, she scratched behind his ears and said, "Good boy." 2 words. Tessic noted them in his file. They were the first words of unambiguous affection he had heard Marin speak aloud in any context. Day 174. Torek invited Marin to observe his species' gravity athletics practice in the auxiliary bay. Marin came. She sat on the observation bench with the beagle in her lap, a genuinely absurd image. A 12-kilogram dog draped across the knees of a girl who weighed barely 3 times that, its ears hanging past her thighs. And when Torek completed a dead lift that made the observation deck vibrate and the lighting fixtures sway, she said, "Nice," quietly enough that only the beagle and the 2 Varathi students beside her heard it. But Torek heard it. Kalsethi hearing was exceptional at bass frequencies. His skin lightened at every joint. Day 179. Marin's mother appeared at Tessic's office during her shift break. She looked different from the corridor conversation at month 3, less raw, more focused, the expression of someone who has noticed a change and is not yet willing to trust it. She mentioned a name at dinner, Marin's mother said. Rilith. She said Rilith's secondary eyelids do this thing when she's trying not to laugh, and it makes Marin want to say funnier things to see if she can make it happen faster. She paused. That is the longest sentence my daughter has said to me in 7 months. Tessic waited. And she said Torek is the strongest person she's ever seen, and he's afraid of bumping into people, and she thinks that's Marin's mother stopped. Her composure held, but the edges trembled. She said she thinks that's sweet. Commander, my daughter has not used the word sweet about another human being since her grandmother died. The beagle, Tessic said. The beagle, Marin's mother confirmed. I know, he started it. He walked up to them and he sat down and he made her follow because she would follow him anywhere. She has followed him everywhere since the funeral, and he walked her straight into other people. She looked at her hands. A 12-kilogram dog with bad joints did what I could not do. I don't know whether to be grateful or ashamed. Grateful, Tessic said. The shame serves no function. She nodded. She did not look entirely convinced, but she nodded, and when she left, Tessic added a note to his file. Maternal awareness of social progress confirmed. Primary catalyst, the beagle. Secondary catalyst, the beagle's tendency to approach isolated individuals independent of handler direction. Tertiary catalyst, unclear. Possibly the specific gravity of Kalsethi breakfast porridge. He did not explain the third entry. Some notes were for himself. Day 182. A small thing. Tessic almost missed it. Marin was walking to the education module with the beagle trotting beside her, and Rilith walking on her other side, a formation that had become routine over the previous 2 weeks when Rilith stumbled over a deck seam. A minor trip, nothing injurious, but Marin's hand shot out and caught Rilith's arm before the Varathi girl could fall, and the contact skin to scaling, human to alien, voluntary and instinctive and immediate, lasted approximately 2 seconds before Marin released it and said, "Watch the seam, it catches everyone." The words were nothing. The contact was everything. Tessic filed it under involuntary protective response and noted that Marin's social buffer zone, which he had measured at 15 centimeters for 5 months, had collapsed to 0 for 2 seconds and had not triggered a retreat. Day 185. A staff meeting. Dravos, the Peleny social coordinator who had filed the original concern about Marin on day 14, submitted an updated assessment. Her bioluminescent patterns cycled through the warm spectrum sequences that indicated positive outcome reporting as she presented her findings. Commander, the human child social mapping overlay has restructured entirely in the past 5 weeks. She has moved from isolate status to a stable cluster of 4 cross-species, with secondary connections to 6 additional students. Her verbal initiation rate has increased by a factor I cannot accurately calculate because the baseline was effectively 0. Tessic nodded. The interesting data point, Dravos continued, and her patterns shifted to the blue-white sequences that indicated she was about to say something she found genuinely puzzling, is that the social mapping change extends beyond the child. The 4-student cluster she has formed, the 2 Kalsethi, the Drenathi, and the Verathi girl, shows the highest cross-species cohesion score in the module, higher than any cluster I have observed in 3 years of staffing this outpost, and the common variable in every interaction that formed the cluster was the beagle. The beagle is not in your social mapping model. No, Commander, the beagle is not a student, but the beagle appears to be functioning as what our literature calls a social catalyst, an element that does not participate in the social structure but whose presence enables connections that would not otherwise form. She paused. Her pattern cycled through a sequence Tessic had never seen from her before, a complex blend of warm and cool that he suspected was the Peleny equivalent of bemused respect. I have updated the model to include the beagle. He is the only non-sapient organism I have ever coded into a social mapping overlay. Day 189. The incident Tessic would replay in his memory more than any other. The education module's environmental system malfunctioned during the 3rd instruction period. A pressure variance in the atmospheric recycler produced a low, cycling hum that rose and fell in a frequency range uncomfortable for most carbon-based auditory systems and actively distressing for species with heightened sensitivity. For the Verathi, an irritant. For the Kalsethi, a mild headache trigger. For Myril and the 3 other Drenathi students, whose auditory sensitivity exceeded most species by an order of magnitude, it was physically painful. Myril's hands went to her ears. Her compact body curled inward, silver fur bristling along her spine, her oversized pupils contracting to pinpoints the Drenathi acute distress response, full sensory retraction when input exceeded processing capacity. The sound was not dangerous. Maintenance had been alerted, the repair crew en route. But for a Drenathi adolescent with underdeveloped auditory dampening, those 15 to 20 minutes until repair would be acute misery. Marin moved before Tessic could reach for his comm. She crossed the module in 4 strides, the beagle scrambling to keep up behind her, and dropped to her knees beside Myril's chair. She did not ask permission. She did not hesitate. She lifted the beagle, all 12 stiff-jointed kilograms of him, and set him in Myril's lap. "Hold him," Marin said. Her voice was steady in a way Tessic had never heard from her, not flat, not the minimum viable monotone. Steady. The steadiness of someone who knew what they were doing because they had been on the receiving end of it. Press your hands into his fur. Feel where his ribs move. Match your breathing to his. Myril's eyes found Marin's face. Her trembling hands sank into the beagle's coat, dense, warm, the texture of something that had been alive for 9 years and carried every one of those years in the depth of its fur. The dog did not resist, did not startle. He settled. His body went heavy in Myril's lap. His breathing deepened into that slow, audible rhythm, the rhythm Tessic had heard every day under Marin's desk. The rhythm he now understood was not background noise, but a signal, a broadcast on a frequency that bypassed language and species, and every wall that grief or fear could build. Myra leaned forward over the dog, pressing her sensitive ears against his fur, and the sound of the recycler was still there. But so was the sound of Pepper, the heartbeat, dense and measured, the breathing, slow and deep, and the trembling slowed and steadied and stopped. Marin's hand was on Myra's shoulder, small and certain, the hand of a child who had held a dog's ear in a corridor because it was the only thing keeping her attached to the world, and who understood, in the way that only someone who has needed to be held can understand, what it meant to hold someone else. "He's got you," she said. "Just breathe with him." Tessic watched from the observation station. He watched a human child who had not voluntarily touched another being in 7 months put her hand on an alien girl's shoulder and hold it there steady, grounding, the way a line holds a vessel in a current. He watched the beagle lie in a Drenathi, adolescent's lap and breathe, just exist, just be 12 kilograms of warm patience. And he watched the breathing become a bridge between two children who shared no evolutionary history, no common language for pain, and no reason to trust each other, except that one of them had a dog, and the dog had decided that everyone in this room was his responsibility. The maintenance crew repaired the recycler in 14 minutes. Myra did not let go of the dog for 23. When she lifted her head, her pupils had returned to their normal expanded state, and she looked at Marin with an expression Tessic had catalogued across 9 species, the expression of someone who has been found in a place they believed was unreachable. "Thank you," Myra said. "It's Pepper," Marin said. "Thank him." She paused, and something complicated moved across her face, grief and memory, and the shadow of a wall that had more windows in it now than walls. "He was my grandmother's dog. She died. And for a while he was the only one I could." She stopped, swallowed, looked at the beagle in Myra's lap, the old dog with his white muzzle and his clicking joints, and finished the sentence not with words but with the look on her face, which said everything that needed saying. "He's good at this," she said instead, "being the thing you hold on to." Myra looked down at the beagle. The beagle looked up at Myra. His tail moved once, redistributing approximately half a year's worth of beagle hair across Myra's uniform in a single sweep. "He is very warm," Myra said. "Yeah," Marin almost smiled. Tessic saw it, the muscles activated, the corners of her mouth lifting by a fraction, not quite a smile, closer than anything he had observed in 7 months. "Yeah, he really is." Day 203. Tessic arrived at the education module 30 minutes before the morning period and found his desk occupied. Pepper was asleep on his chair. The beagle had arranged himself in a tight curl, nose tucked under tail, ears draped over the armrest, breathing with the profound unconsciousness of an animal that had decided this surface belonged to him through a legal framework no other species recognized. Marin was sitting on the floor beside the chair, her back against the desk, a data tablet on her knees. Rilith sat cross-legged beside her, their shoulders almost touching, almost, not quite, a distance that represented months of work. Torek sat across from them, his enormous frame folded into a position that made his joints creak, a tablet looking absurd in his massive hands. Myra was curled against Torek's side, her silver fur stark against his amber skin, reading over his shoulder with one hand resting on the beagle's tail where it hung over the chair's edge. They were studying, all 4 of them together in the quiet before the module opened, with the beagle asleep on the instructor's chair as the gravitational center of their arrangement. 3 species, 4 children, 1 old dog. The module's viewport showed the Outpost's local star rising over the planetary horizon, casting long amber light across the deck, and in that light the group looked like something that should have been impossible and was instead simply, stubbornly true. Tessic stood in the doorway for a full minute. He did not enter. This was the image he would carry, not the corridor, not the nutrition bay, not the malfunction and the girl kneeling beside the Drenathi. This. 4 children arranged around a sleeping beagle in early morning light, 6 relay jumps from the only planet any of them had ever called home. The beagle's breathing was the only sound steady, unhurried, the metronome of something old and patient that had done this work before, and would do it again for as long as the work needed doing and its joints held and its heart kept beating. Marin's hand rested on the dog's flank. Her eyes were on the tablet, but her fingers moved in the slow, absent rhythm of someone who touches a familiar thing without thinking. The wall was still there. Tessic could see it in the set of her jaw, in the way she stiffened when Rilith's elbow brushed hers, and then forced herself not to pull away. But it had so many windows now that the light coming through was almost indistinguishable from the light on the other side. 207 days after Marin Calloway arrived on Outpost Saren 4 silent, and folded inward, and holding a beagle's ear like a lifeline, she laughed. Tessic heard it from across the module, a short, startled sound, pulled out of her by something Torek said about the specific gravity of Kalseth a breakfast porridge relative to hull plate sealant. And it was not a large laugh or a long one, but it was real and it was hers, and it echoed in the module the way a single clear note echoes in a room that has been quiet for a very long time. Rilith looked at her. Meyer looked at her. Torek, who had not intended to be funny and was wearing the pleased bewilderment of someone who has accidentally produced something wonderful, looked at her with his skin lightening at every joint. The module's other students did not look, because the sound of a child laughing in a classroom was so ordinary it did not register as an event. But Tessic registered it the way his instruments registered deep structure activity, a movement in something foundational, a shift that meant the structure above it had changed permanently. And Pepper, asleep on the instructor's chair with his nose under his tail, lifted his head at the sound. His ears swung. His brown eyes found Marin's face across the room, the way they always found her, the way they had found her every day for the 2 years since her grandmother died and left the girl and the dog holding each other in a house that smelled like rosemary. His tail moved one sweep, too heavy and sure, the wag of a dog who has heard the sound he has been waiting for. Then he set his chin down and closed his eyes, and resumed the slow, patient work of existing in a room where his girl was laughing. Tessic returned to his observation file and added a single word: laughter. Then he closed the file. The question in front of him was the one the directorate had asked the formal assessment, the one requiring the language of metrics and evidence-based recommendations, the one he had delayed because formal language flattened the things it described into shapes that fit archives and lost everything that made them worth archiving. Commander Tessic Val opened the behavioral assessment, the official document, the one the archivists would flag, and began to write. This office was asked to assess the impact of an Earth-origin domestic canine, Canis lupus familiaris, breed, beagle, age 9 standard years, mass 12 kg, designation Pepper, on the social integration outcomes of a human adolescent M. Calloway, age 12, presenting persistent grief-related social withdrawal following parental bereavement and interstellar relocation. I have spent 7 months documenting the interactions between this child and this animal, and the subsequent interactions between this child and her peers across 3 species. I have 207 days of observational data, behavioral metrics, social mapping overlays, and developmental trajectory models. The data tells one story. The story is simple enough that the data almost gets in the way of telling it. The animal did not fix the child. There is no mechanism in the xenopsychological literature for an animal fixing a child, and any framework that claims otherwise misunderstands both children and animals. What the animal did was something the literature does not have a term for, and I suspect this is because the literature was not written by anyone who had watched a 12-kilogram beagle walk across a classroom floor and sit in front of a boy 5 times its size and weight, with absolute patience, until the boy's hand came down. The animal provided a bridge between the child and the room, between grief and the willingness to let someone sit beside you while you carry it, between silence and the first word. between the last place that felt like home and the possibility that another place could. The bridge was 12 kilograms, had brown and white fur, ears that dragged on the deck plating, arthritic joints that clicked when it stood, and a daily metabolic output that shed enough hair to require weekly maintenance on the module's filtration system. This office has no classification for what the beagle did. Our behavioral assessment matrices begin at risk and scale through graduated levels of intervention. There is no category for an organism whose primary function is to exist, warmly and patiently, in a room, and by existing make the room a place where a frightened child can open her hands. I am recommending that the Outpost's Youth Development Program explore the integration of Earth origin companion animals into joint species educational environments. I am aware this will generate procurement concerns, environmental control objections, filtration budget revisions, and a minimum of 40 pages of regulatory review. I am also aware that a 9-year-old beagle with arthritic joints, a white muzzle, and a documented tendency to sleep on unauthorized surfaces accomplished more for interspecies social cohesion in this module than any structured intervention I have designed or administered in 20 years. Addendum: I have been asked separately whether the beagle poses any environmental or safety risk to the module's population. For the record, the animal sheds at a rate that requires filtration maintenance intervention every 7 to 10 standard days. Its nails, which click on the deck plating at a frequency of approximately 4 clicks per second during transit, have left minor surface scoring on the flooring near my desk. It has consumed 1 data stylus, 2 nutrition bar wrappers, and a section of seating cushion that it extracted from a chair in my absence and deposited, partially digested, under my desk. It sleeps on my chair. I have not sat in my chair in 11 days. The animal poses no safety risk. It poses a significant risk to furniture, atmospheric filtration budgets, and the professional composure of anyone who watches it lean against a frightened child and breathe. The assessment matrix requires me to quantify the animal's impact on a 7-point developmental scale. I am entering an 8. The scale only goes to 7. I am aware. The dog does not fit the scale. The dog has never fit any scale anyone has tried to put it on. I believe that is the point. He saved the document. He leaned back in the secondary chair, the one beside his desk, the one he had been using for weeks because the beagle had claimed the primary one and Tessic had discovered he did not want it back. The morning period was beginning. Students filtered in through the main entrance, the daily reconstitution of a small society that dissolved each evening and reformed each morning along lines that shifted gradually, the way coastlines shift imperceptibly day to day, unmistakably over months. Marin came through the door with Rilith on one side and Myrle on the other, the beagle trotting ahead with the proprietary air of an animal that considered this room his jurisdiction, and the children in it his professional responsibility. Torek was already at their table, his massive frame wedged into a protesting chair, waving them over. Marin sat. She said something to Rilith that made the Varathi girl's secondary eyelids flutter in the pattern that meant amusement. Myrle settled into her chair and immediately leaned toward the beagle, one hand extended, seeking the velvet ear. The beagle circled once under the table, twice, performed the ancient canine ritual of turning 3 times on a spot indistinguishable from every other spot, and settled with his chin on Marin's boot. She reached down without looking the automatic gesture, the hand finding the familiar shape in the dark and pepper side, and the module filled with the noise of 41 students beginning their day, and Marin Calloway was inside the noise instead of outside it. Not fixed, not repaired, not rescued by any mechanism the assessment literature recognized or the directorate's frameworks could quantify. Something quieter and more honest than any of those words. Something a 9-year-old beagle with a white muzzle and clicking joints had carried into this room on day 1 and applied, without instruction or protocol or awareness, that what he was doing had a clinical name, every single day since. Accompanied, that was what the beagle did. That was what the beagle had always done, from the first night in Marin's grandmother's house, when a puppy too young to know what it was doing had climbed onto a bed and pressed itself against an old woman's feet, to the last night in that house, when the same dog, older now, had pressed itself against a girl's feet instead, and matched its breathing to hers, and stayed through the long hours when the house was quiet, and the absence in it was the loudest thing either of them had ever heard. 12 kilograms of patience that had been doing this work since before Marin was born, since before her grandmother carried him home in a cardigan pocket, since before Earth dogs learned the ancient, unimprovable trick that made them Earth dogs, the trick of sitting beside the lonely thing and staying, simply staying, until the lonely thing remembered it did not have to be lonely, and the room remembered it did not have to be quiet, and the girl remembered that the hand reaching down to find a familiar ear was also a hand that could reach across a table, and across a species, and across whatever distance grief had put between her and the rest of the living world. Tessic Val watched the module settle into its morning rhythm, and thought about the 8 he had entered on a 7-point scale, and did not regret it. Pepper was asleep on his chair again by the second instruction period. Tessic taught the lesson standing. He did not move the dog. Nobody asked him to. Nobody ever did.